For 7 years he had been building ports, and now he sits naked on a foreign rock, watching an entire city slowly die. The jetties will rot away by winter. The first storm from the southwest will sweep away the fishermen along with their children, and he is the only one who knows this. But first, let's rewind. Salt water gushed down his throat. Daniel Khan's whole body jerked. A wave washed over his back and rolled away. He coughed. He rolled onto his side. The sun hit his eyes. He squinted. He raised a trembling hand. He was naked, completely naked on a shore he had never seen before. People were shouting nearby, in a language he shouldn't have understood a word of. And he understood every one. One is shouting that they need to pull the boat out before it's too late. Another yells that the rope will snap. A third just curses. Dan sits up, opens his eyes. A narrow cove, white houses on the hillside, olive trees, goats on the rocks. 3 men in linen tunics are pulling the lopsided boat and losing. No wires, no planes in the sky. The air smells of fish, resin, and smoke. He runs his hand over his face and looks at his palms. The same scars from the rebar. The same mole on his wrist. He is himself. But he isn't there. The last thing he remembers, the wet highway from Long Beach, a truck with a blow to his left side, the crunch of metal, darkness. And now pebbles, the sun, and a foreign sea. He stands up. His legs buckle. He falls to one knee. He stands up again. And the first thing he does is look at the bay with a professional eye. It's stronger than him. 7 years in port construction don't fade away, even after death. The bay opens to the southwest, completely exposed to the winds. The water is 2 meters deep near the shore. The bottom is muddy. The piers will rot by winter. Any autumn storm hits this place like an open palm. The whole harbor, a disaster. And just then, a girl of about 10 runs up to him, barefoot. She holds out a clay mug of water, warm. Someone has simply brought water to a naked stranger. Dan drinks and suddenly realizes he's crying. Not out of fear, because the water is warm and someone thought of him. He wants to say thank you. He opens his mouth, and the words come out on their own, in their language. The girl smiles and runs away. A large man is already walking toward him from the jetties, tanned to the point of blackness, a beard streaked with gray, the hands of a laborer. He calls himself Stefanos. He asks where Dan is from. Dan replies that he's from far away. Stefanos grunts. He says it's obvious. He to his house. He says the sea doesn't wash people ashore for no reason. Apparently, the gods want the stranger to live. The town's streets are narrow and winding, walls of unfired brick, the smell of manure and fried fish. Children run about barefoot. 3,000 people, maybe fewer. Stefanos' wife silently sets a bowl of lentils and a piece of coarse bread in front of Dan. Dan devours it all in a minute. Stefanos watches and asks what the stranger can do. Dan thinks. He looks out toward the sea and says he knows how to build ports. Stefanos laughs. He decides the stranger is delirious from thirst, but he doesn't take the food away and doesn't chase him out. Dan doesn't sleep the first night. He lies there and listens to the waves crashing against the shore. The rhythm is off, too frequent for a cove like this. That means the bottom is shallow and the wave breaks sooner than it should. He lies in the darkness of a foreign world and calculates the wave period by sound. In the morning, he goes out before dawn. He sits on a rock. For 3 hours, he watches the bay. How the sun rises, how the wind shifts, how the waves roll in from the southwest and crash right into the piers. The logs are old, rope fastenings. He counts 5 cracks right through them. 2 piers are held together by a promise. 1 storm and they'll be gone. Yet the fishermen come out here every morning, with their children, with their catch, with their lives. And this is where the real fun begins. Dan walks toward the jetties where an old man is working, gloomy, wiry, hands covered in chalk dust. He hammers a wedge between the logs and mutters under his breath. This is Nikon, a mason, one of the best in town. Which is to say, not exactly, because there are 4 masons here, and 2 of them are his nephews. Nikon eyes the stranger with disinterest, a penniless drifter spat out by the sea. Dan asks for a scrap of rope. He picks up 2 flat stones, a clay bowl of water. He ties the stones together with the rope. He places the bowl on a level section of the planks, the simplest spirit level. Nikon stops hammering and turns around. Dan walks along the planks. He stops, he checks, he walks on, he returns, and says calmly, without a hint of defiance, 3 of the 5 piles are leaning toward the sea. Nikon looks at the water in the bowl. The level doesn't lie. The water is slanted. 3 piles are leaning toward the sea. That means every tide, every wave is working to loosen them. No storm is even needed. The sea will pull them out on its own within a year. Nikon looks at the piles, at the water, at the stranger. He's silent for a long time. Then he asks where they burn lime in town. Dan sits down, takes a splinter, draws a rectangle on the wet board, a line from the shore into the sea, a second one at an angle. He says it's a breakwater. Put it in the right place, and the wave from the southwest will break against it instead of the piers. The boats will stay in calm water even during a storm. Nikon says they've built piers before. They get washed away every 3 years. Poseidon doesn't like it when they block his path. Dan shakes his head. The problem isn't Poseidon. The problem is the angle. They build the piers perpendicular to the shore, but they need to be at an angle, so the wave slides along the wall and loses its force. And another thing, you don't need stone upon stone. You need mortar that hardens right in the water. Nikon says that doesn't happen. Dan says it does. Volcanic ash, lime, seawater. Nikon calls the stranger crazy. But there's no anger in his voice, just curiosity. And Dan realizes he's found his first listener. In the evening, Stefanos tells them about the city. The old Archon died 2 months ago. Now his daughter Helena rules, though no one prepared her for this. Her 16-year-old brother Timon is angry that his sister has taken his place. And to the north lies their rich and powerful neighbor, Theos, with a proper harbor. Big ships sail past them straight to Theos, because there's nowhere to dock in their city, nowhere to unload. The docks are falling apart. Every year they grow poorer while Theos grows richer. In 3 years, maybe 5, Theos will simply buy them out, or come with ships. Dan eats fish. He listens. He thinks. And he says he needs to speak with Helena. Stefanos nearly chokes. A stranger with no name and no clothes doesn't talk to the Archantessa. Dan replies that he does have a name. Stefanos himself gave him clothes. And he also has something for Helena. A plan. Stefanos shakes his head. He says the stranger is definitely crazy, but he promises to try. Stefanos kept his word. On the 5th day after the sea washed Dan ashore, a fisherman brought him to the Archon's house. It was only loosely called a house, a 2-story building made of white stone, the largest in Kalydros, with columns at the entrance that were slightly crooked. Dan automatically noted that the foundation had settled on the eastern side. An old olive tree grew in the courtyard. A stone table stood beneath the olive tree. A woman sat at the table. Dan expected to see anyone but her. An old woman in mourning, a frightened girl, a haughty aristocrat. Helena was neither one, nor the other, nor the third. She was 27, tall, dark hair pulled back, without adornments, black clothes, mourning her father. Her eyes were heavy and direct. She looked at Dan the way an inspector looks at a contractor who's a week late. Standing next to her was a young man of about 16, Timon, her brother. He looked like her, but his eyes lacked her heaviness. There was anger, a quiet, constant anger at everything. Behind Timon stood 2 old men in expensive tunics, advisors. They looked at Dan as if he were dirt that Stefanos had brought into the courtyard for some reason. Helena spoke first. She asked who he was. Dan gave his name. She raised an eyebrow. The name was foreign to these parts. She asked where he was from. Dan said from very far away, that the sea had washed him ashore, that he was a builder. One of the counselors snorted. He said there were plenty of builders in Kalydros. Dan looked at him. Then he looked at Helena. He asked if he could have a patch of ground in the courtyard. Helena nodded. Dan knelt down in front of the stone table. He picked up a stick and began to sketch on the trampled ground of the courtyard. He sketched for 10 minutes. No one interrupted him. Even the advisors fell silent. Gradually, the Bay of Calidros appeared on the ground. Not just a picture, a diagram, with depth lines, with wind directions, with markings where the waves crash hardest. Dan was drawing with a stick in the mud, but the lines were precise. 7 years of working with port blueprints had given his hand a confidence that couldn't be faked. Then he drew a second sketch next to it, the same bay, but with a pier on the north side, with a breakwater, with a dock, with a storage area, with a separate spot for ship repairs. He looked up. Helena was standing over the drawing. She had gotten up from the table and walked over while he was sketching. She stood there and watched. Timon came over too. The anger in his eyes gave way for a second to something resembling interest, but only for a second. Dan spoke up. He said that Calidros Bay was killing itself, exposed to the southwest winds. The shallow bottom amplifies the waves. The piers are situated at the most dangerous point. Every storm is a gamble. But the bay has one advantage that Theos doesn't have. The rocky foundation is close to the shore, 30 meters. You can build a pier on the rock that will stand for centuries. Not wooden, stone, on mortar that hardens in seawater. One of the advisors said that was impossible. Mortar doesn't harden in water. Dan didn't argue. He said he'd prove it. All you need is lime and volcanic ash. Helena asked where to get volcanic ash. Dan said he'd heard from sailors about ash quarries to the southeast. A 2-day journey. Helena was silent. She looked at the drawing. Then she asked what he wanted in return. Dan replied, 10 workers, 2 talents of silver, 3 months. If in 3 months there isn't a section of the breakwater standing in the bay that can withstand an autumn storm, he'll leave town. Timon said that 2 talents of silver is a quarter of the treasury. He said that giving a quarter the treasury to a vagabond spat out by the sea is madness. One of the advisors agreed. The second remained silent. Helena looked at Dan for a long time. He held her gaze. She said, fine, 10 workers, 2 talents, 3 months. Timon turned pale with rage and left. The advisors exchanged glances. Helena added, she said that if in 3 months the pier isn't standing, Dan leave alive. That was all he could count on. Dan nodded. That was enough. He started the next morning. The first week was spent on reconnaissance. Dan walked around the bay 4 times. He measured the depth with a rope tied to a stone. He counted his steps. He memorized where the rock came closer to the surface. Nikon walked with him. The old mason didn't believe in mortar setting in water, but he was curious, and Dan explained. Not from top to bottom, not like a teacher to a student, like one master to another. He explained that a wave isn't just a blow. A wave is energy that travels through the water, and that energy can be redirected. If the breakwater is at the right angle, the wave slides along it and loses its force. If the breakwater is perpendicular to the shore, it takes all the energy upon itself. Nikon listened. Then he'd pick up a stone and throw it into the water at different angles. He watched the ripples spread out. He thought. He nodded. Or he didn't nod. He argued. Dan valued his arguments. Nikon thought with his hands and eyes. He had no formulas, but he had 40 years of working with stone and water and wind. He knew things that weren't in any textbook. He knew which stone would crack in the cold, which would hold up, where to get lime that wouldn't crumble in a year. Dan understood quickly. He needed his own mind, but he also needed Nikon's hands and knowledge. It wasn't a one-sided apprenticeship. It was a partnership. In the second week, Dan sent 2 workers to the southeast to look for an ash quarry. He described what to look for: gray or white powder in places where there had once been volcanic activity. Light, dry, like flour made from stone. The workers left and returned 5 days later, with a sack of gray powder and the news that the quarry was huge, a whole hill of this ash. Dan poured the powder onto a rock. He touched it, rubbed it between his fingers, sniffed it. This was it. Puzzolana, volcanic ash, the key to everything. He mixed the first batch that very evening. By the light of oil lamps on the shore, Nikon stood nearby. Stefanos had come too, and about 5 other onlookers. Dan took some lime, added the ash, about 2 to 1, added water, seawater, mixed it with his hands. It turned into a thick gray mass. He poured it into a wooden mold, a square the size of his palm, and lowered the mold into the water, into the sea. Nikon asked why. Dan said, "Wait." 2 days later, Dan pulled the mold out. The mixture had hardened. Not just hardened, it had turned to stone. A hard, smooth, gray stone. Dan tapped it. The sound was dull and solid. He handed a piece to Nikon. The old stonemason took it, turned it over, papped it with his hammer. He tried to split it. He couldn't. He looked at Dan. He looked at the sea. Then he said quietly that if any of the priests found out about this, there would be trouble. A stone born in seawater. It is either a gift from Poseidon or sacrilege. There is no third option. Dan nodded. He understood. In this world, technology doesn't work without religion. You need a priest. You need a blessing. You need a ritual. Otherwise, people won't build with this material. They'll be afraid. But first, he had to prove that the material worked. Not in the palm of his hand, in the sea. Dan began building a test pier the next day, 20 meters. That was all he could manage in 3 months with 10 workers. 20 meters of stone and concrete extending from the shore into the sea, at an angle to the wave line, on a rocky foundation. It was a start. Dan got an audience with Helena and sketched out a plan for the new harbor right on the ground in the courtyard. Helena gave him 10 workers, 2 talents of silver, and 3 months to build the test pier. Dan found puzzolana ash and created the first sample of concrete that hardened in seawater. Nikon became his first real partner on the construction site. Building in this world meant doing everything by hand. Every stone was lifted by muscle. Every sack of ash was carried on the back. Every pile was driven in with a hammer held by 2 men. Dan had forgotten what that was like. In Rotterdam, he'd had cranes and concrete mixers and crews of 40 men with hard hats and walkie-talkies. Here he had 10 men in tunics who looked at him with suspicion. Half of them had come because Helena had ordered them to. The other half because they were getting paid. Not a single one had come because he believed in it. Dan spent the first week of construction preparing the foundation. The rock outcrop rose to the surface 30 meters from the shore. Between the shore and the rock, the bottom was muddy. The mud had to be removed down to solid soil. Dan put 4 men on the job. They scooped out the mud with buckets while standing waist-deep in the water. Heavy, dirty, seemingly pointless work. By the 3rd day, 2 of them said they were leaving. Dan didn't try to talk them out of it. He asked Nikon to find replacements. Nikon brought his nephew, Femia, a young guy, strong, not the brightest, but a hard worker. And he brought another one, Jamon, a quiet man in his 40s, a former bricklayer. He'd broken his arm 3 years ago, and it had healed crooked. He couldn't work with a hammer anymore, but he could mix mortar. Dan put Jamon in charge of mixing concrete, and it turned out to be the best decision of the first month. Jamon was patient, methodical. He mixed every batch the same way, same proportions, same order. Lime, ash, water, mix. Check the consistency. Dan showed him once, and Jamon repeated it over and over without deviation. The problem started in the 2nd week. Timon, Helena's brother. He came to the construction site with 2 advisors and stood on the shore watching. Then he approached Dan. He asked why the pier wasn't being built where the old piers had stood. Dan explained. The old piers stood at the most vulnerable point of the bay. The pier needed to be built further northwest, where the rock was closer and the angle to the waves was better. Timon said the fishermen were used to the old spot. Dan said the fishermen would have to get used to the new one. Timon said that an outsider didn't tell the people of Kalidros where to moor their boats. His voice was even. The anger wasn't in his words, but in his eyes. Dan understood. It wasn't about the piers. Timon was 16 years old. His father was dead. His sister was in charge. The outsider had received the money, the people, and the attention that rightfully belonged to him. Every one of Dan's successes was a personal insult to the boy who wanted to be a man. Dan didn't argue. He said Timon was right. The fishermen were more important. He suggested that Timon choose where to put a temporary wooden pier for the fishermen while the pier was being built. Timon hadn't expected that. He paused. He pointed to a section of the shore. Dan nodded and said it was a good spot. It really was a decent spot. Timon left. The advisors followed him. Dan exhaled. This boy was dangerous. Not because he was strong, because he was wounded. Wounded people do unpredictable things. By the end of the first month, the test pier had extended 8 meters from the shore. 8 meters. It wasn't much, but every meter was a lesson. Dan learned to work with local stone. He learned to calculate concrete proportions without scales or measuring cups. He learned to explain to people what to do without blueprints, because none of the workers knew how to read them. He gestured with his hands. He built small clay models. He arranged stones on the shore in the right order and said, "Repeat this, but 10 times as much." It didn't always work. In the third week, one of the workers poured the mortar without waiting for the formwork to dry. The concrete ran. 4 hours of work were lost. Dan didn't yell. He demonstrated it again. He explained why it was important to wait. The worker shrugged. He said they'd always poured it when it was ready before. Dan realized he didn't have time to retrain everyone. He needed a foreman, someone who understood his method and could pass it on to the rest. Nikon was too old for constant supervision. Themi was too young and inattentive. Gemon was perfect in temperament, but his broken arm prevented him from being on the construction site all day. The answer came from an unexpected source. Taya, Nikon's daughter. She came to the construction site every day. She brought her father food. She sat on a rock and watched. Silence. For an hour or two. Then she would leave. Dan noticed her but paid no attention for the first 2 weeks. In the third week, he saw her fix the formwork that Femi had set up crookedly, silently, without a word. She simply walked over, shifted the board a palm's width to the left, and went back to the rock. Dan walked over to the formwork. He checked it. Taya had moved it exactly where it needed to be. He looked at her. She was looking at the sea. He walked over. He asked how she knew where to place it. Taya answered briefly. She said it was obvious. The board was crooked. The mortar would have leaked out the left edge. Dan asked if she saw anything else was wrong. Taya paused. Then she stood up and walked along the pier under construction. She pointed out 3 spots. Here, the stone isn't set tightly, and the water will wash it away. Here, the mortar layer is too thin. Here, the joint between the blocks isn't covered by the row above. 3 problems. All 3 real. Dan had seen 2 of them himself and was about to fix them. He'd missed the 3rd. He looked at Nikon, who was standing nearby and had heard everything. Nikon was looking at his daughter. There was a strange expression on his face, a mixture of pride and pain. His daughter saw the stone better than his, but she was a woman. In this world, a woman doesn't work on a construction site. Dan told Taya that he needed someone to monitor the quality of the mortar. Jamon would be mixing it, but checking the consistency and supervising the laying required a separate set of eyes. Taya asked if they paid for it. Dan said yes. Taya looked at her father. Nikon turned away. He said nothing. Taya said, "Okay." She went to work the next day. The first day was tough. The workers didn't want to listen to a woman. Femi laughed openly. Taya didn't argue. She just walked over and silently redid whatever had been done poorly. By the end of the day, Femi had stopped laughing because Taya had redone his work 4 times, and she was right every time. By the end of the first month, the construction site was running like a well-oiled machine. Jamon mixed the mortar. Taya checked the quality. Nikon supervised the masonry. Femi and the others hauled and laid the stones. Dan marked out the lines and kept count. 8 meters of pier, crooked, imperfect, but standing in the water on a rocky foundation. The concrete held. The stone didn't shift. The joints were tight. 8 meters of hope. That was when Callie arrived. She didn't come to Dan. She came to Femi, who had cut his hand on the edge of a stone. Blood was gushing. Femi sat on the shore, white as a sheet, pressing a rag against the wound. The rag was dirty. Dan knew that an infection in this world was a death sentence. Callie appeared from somewhere on the hill, red-haired, freckled, in a stained apron, with a bag slung over her shoulder, bundles of herbs sticking out of it. She crouched down next to Femi, pulled his hand away from the wound, and looked at it. She said it wasn't deep. She rinsed the wound with something from a small jug. Femi hissed. She applied a poultice of crushed leaves. She bandaged it with a clean cloth, quickly, confidently, like a surgeon. Then she stood up and looked at the construction site. She said they'd have plenty of cuts and burns and broken fingers here if they kept working without gloves. Dan looked at the workers' hands. Bare hands on sharp stones and hot lime. He'd worked on construction sites for 7 years, and the first thing they gave every new worker was gloves and a hard hat. Here, there was neither. He hadn't even think about it. He'd simply forgotten. Because in his world, it was so basic it didn't require a second thought. He walked over to Callie. He asked if she could make an ointment for lime burns, for the guys working at the kilns. Callie raised her eyebrows. No one had ever asked her for an ointment for a specific purpose before. Usually, people came after they'd already been burned. She said she could. She asked how severe the burns were. Dan described them. Callie nodded. She said she'd bring it tomorrow. And she did. A small pot of ointment made from fat and ground herbs. It worked perfectly. The burns healed twice as fast. Dan asked how much he owed her. Callie named her price. Dan paid. Then he asked if she could come to the construction site every day, to check on the workers, to treat wounds right away, not after they'd gotten infected. Callie looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was the first person to offer her a steady job, not just a one-time visit when it's already too late. Dan said he needed healthy workers. A sick worker is a lost day. A lost day is a lost meter of the pier. Callie nodded. She said she'd come tomorrow. She came every day after that. Construction of the test pier began and reached 8 meters by the end of the first month. Taya, Nikon's daughter, showed an exceptional feel for stone and became the quality control supervisor. Timon showed hostility toward Dan out of jealousy over influence. Herbalist Callie became the site's permanent medic after Dan hired her to systematically treat the workers' wounds. The second month was the month of concrete. Dan sent 3 workers to the ash quarry with donkeys. They hauled the ash in sacks. 2 days there, 2 back. Each trip provided enough supplies for 3 days of work. That wasn't enough. Dan drew a supply diagram for Helena. He showed that if they added another group of 3 people with donkeys, the deliveries would be continuous. One group would go there while the other returned. Helena looked at the diagram. She looked at Dan. She said it made sense, and that she was surprised no one had thought of transporting supplies in shifts before. Dan didn't bother explaining that this was basic logistics taught in freshman year. He just nodded. Helena provided 3 more workers, 13 people. That was enough to work with. The wall grew. 10 meters, 12, 15. Every day they added a little more. The concrete was holding up well. Dan had found the right proportions. 2 parts ash, 1 part lime. Seawater to the right consistency. Jamon mixed it with a pharmacist's precision. Taya checked every batch. If the consistency was off, she rejected it and made them redo it. The workers grumbled. Taya didn't react. Nikon was silently proud. By the middle of the second month, Dan ran into a problem he'd foreseen but hoped to put off. The Temple of Poseidon, or rather, its priest. His name was Autolykos, an elderly man, not evil, not foolish, just certain that the sea belonged to the god and that any construction in the sea required divine permission. Autolykos came to the construction site in the morning. He looked at the pier. He touched the concrete. He sniffed it. Then he said that Dan was building in the waters of Poseidon without a ritual, without a sacrifice, without the temple's permission. He said this calmly, without a threat. But the whole city heard. The workers stopped. Stephanos turned pale. Even Nikon put down his hammer. Dan understood what was happening. The priest isn't against the construction. The priest wants to be part of the construction. He wants his role to be recognized. Dan approached Autolycos. He said he was at fault. He said that in his haste, he had forgotten the most important thing. He said that he couldn't proceed without the blessing of the one who rules the sea. He asked Autolycos to perform the groundbreaking ceremony, a proper one, complete, with a sacrifice, with a prayer. Autolycos looked at him. Dan could see the old man weighing the situation. A stranger who acknowledges the temple's authority. That's good. A stranger who builds with material born of seawater. That's dangerous. Or perhaps a miracle. Autolycos said he would perform the ceremony, but he wanted to know what the material was. Dan explained. Simple, without unnecessary words. Earth's ashes, lime, Poseidon's water. Together they become stone. Earth and sea unite. Dan deliberately used those words. Not lime plus podzolin plus water. Earth and sea. A gift from the earth and a gift from the sea. Autolycus was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. He said the ritual would take place tomorrow at dawn. The ritual was beautiful. Dan stood aside and watched. Autolycos in white robes at the edge of the pier. A prayer to Poseidon, a kid, blood into the water, wine into the water, words to the effect that the people of Kalydros, with the blessing of the god of the eternal sea, were placing a stone in his waters not against his will, but by his will, for the stone was born in his water, and therefore was his child. The workers stood on the shore, quiet, serious. Dan saw how their faces changed. Before the ritual, they were building a strange stranger's project. After the ritual, they were building a pier blessed by Poseidon. It was the same work, the same stones, the same concrete, but the people had changed. They worked faster, more carefully, with a different look on their faces. A girl stood next to Autolycos, young, about 17, blonde hair, a serious face, angular, Melissa. Autolycos' niece, the temple's junior priestess. She looked at the pier, at the concrete, at the water. Then she looked at Dan. There was a question in her eyes. Not hostile, genuine. Who are you, and how do you do this? Dan didn't approach her. Not the right moment. The work continued. 16 meters, 17, 18. There were 3 weeks left until the end of the 3rd month. About the same until the autumn storms. A race. Dan slept 4 hours a night. He ate at the construction site. His hands were covered in calluses and lime burns. Callie rubbed ointment on them every evening and scolded him for not taking care of his skin. Dan said he didn't have time. Callie said that if his hands gave out, there would be no one left to build. She was right. Dan started wrapping his palms. Improvised leather gloves. He made the workers wear the same ones. They complained that they were uncomfortable. Callie said that burns were more uncomfortable. The workers fell silent. By the end of the 2nd month, the pier had reached 19 meters. 1 meter remained. 1 meter and 3 weeks. It seemed like plenty of time, but Dan knew that the last meter was the most important. The head of the pier. The place where the waves hit hardest. Here, the concrete had to be perfect. The stones fitted together without a gap. The joints filled to the last crack. He spent 10 days on that last meter. The workers didn't understand why it took so long. Taya understood. She said it was like the keystone in an arch. If it's weak, the whole arch collapses. If the breakwater's head is weak, the wave will find a gap and tear the breakwater apart from the inside. Dan nodded. Taya understood his language. Not the words, the logic. On the 20th day of the 3rd month, the breakwater was finished. 20 meters of stone and concrete, from the shore into the sea, at a 30-degree angle to the line of the southwest waves. The head was rounded. The base was on the rock. The body was made of concrete blocks poured with mortar. Ugly, rough, gray, but it stood. Helena came to look. She stood on the pier and walked along it to the end, 20 meters. Her footsteps were the only sound. Water lapped below. On one side of the pier, the water was choppy. On the other side, beyond the pier, the water was calm. The difference was visible to the naked eye. Helena reached the end. She turned around. She looked at Dan, who was standing on the shore. She said nothing. She nodded. Now all that was left was to wait. Wait for the storm. 3 days passed in silence. 5. A week. The city waited. Dan waited. He didn't show it, but inside he was trembling. He was confident in his calculations, confident in the concrete, confident in the strength of the pier. But it's one thing to know and another to stand on the shore of an ancient city and wait for the sea to test your work. The storm came on the 12th day of the 4th month, at night. The wind began to pick up toward evening. By midnight, it was howling so loudly that conversation couldn't be heard inside the houses. Waves crashed against the shore. Rain poured down in sheets. The city did not sleep. The old men prayed. The women gathered the children away from the shore. The men sat and waited for morning to go and assess the damage, just like every year. Dan stood on the shore, alone, in the darkness. The rain lashed his face. He could not see the pier. He heard only the roar of the waves. He tried to tell the difference by the sound. The sound of a wave hitting a rock is different from the sound of a wave breaking a rock. The first is dull and steady. The second is with a crash. He listened for 3 hours. Dull thuds, steady, without a crash. At dawn, the rain subsided. The wind was still blowing, but weaker. Fog rose from the water, white and thick. The town came onto the shore. Everyone, old people, children, women, fishermen, bricklayers, they stood and peered into the fog. Gradually, the fog began to lift. First, the shore came into view, then the water line, then the pier. Whole, even, black from the water, standing. Behind it, the bay, calm water. 2 boats moored at the pier before the storm, both intact, both in place. Stefanos was the first to see the boats, his own and his neighbors, intact. He raised his hands to the sky, an ancient gesture of gratitude. Then he turned to Dan. His eyes were wet, not from the rain. Nikon walked toward Dan through the crowd, silently. He reached him, hugged him, so hard that Dan's ribs cracked. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Helena stood to the side, in a dark raincoat, wet from the rain. The wind ruffled her hair. She looked at Dan, not at the pier, at Dan, the way she hadn't looked at anyone before, silently, for a long time. Then she turned away and went into the palace. The city was silent for a day. Then people began to come to the shore, one after another. They touched the pier with their hands. They tapped the concrete. They shook their heads. 20 meters. A small piece of stone in the sea, but it stood firm. The priest Autolik demanded a ceremony to lay the foundation of the pier, and Dan wisely agreed, turning it into an alliance with the temple. The pier was completed to 20 meters by the end of the 3rd month. The first autumn storm hit the bay at night, and the pier withstood it completely. For the first time, the town saw that Dan's design worked. Helena and Nikon accepted him unconditionally. After the storm, everything changed. Dan was no longer a stranger who was merely tolerated. He became the man who had saved 2 boats. In a world where a boat feeds a family, that meant more than any words could say. The day after the storm, 6 people came to see him. Fishermen, bricklayers, a carpenter. They all asked the same thing. Was there work for them? Dan said there was, but he needed Helena's permission to expand. Helena summoned him that same day. The courtyard, the olive tree, a stone table. But this time there were no advisors. Timon wasn't there. Helena sat alone. A piece of concrete lay before her, that very first sample Dan had made under Nikon. She said she'd kept it, said she'd picked it up every day and tried to understand what kind of material it was. A stone that didn't exist, and then it did. She said that after the storm, she had no more doubts. She asked what Dan really wanted, not 10 workers and a piece of the pier, but for real. Dan sat down across from her. He picked up a stick and began sketching again. But this time, not a 20-meter test pier, a full port. The main pier from the northern tip of the bay, D meters. A breakwater on the south side, 150 meters. A stone pier along the east shore. A storage area behind the pier, a way station, a customs area, a ship repair yard, a separate fishing pier so the fishermen wouldn't interfere with merchant ships. Helena looked at the drawing. She was silent. Then she asked how much. Dan named a figure. 20 talents of silver, 100 workers, 2 years. Helena closed her eyes. 20 talents. The entire treasury of Kalidros, and half again on top of that. There was no money. Dan said he knew. He said the money could be borrowed. From merchants. Not local ones, the ones who bring grain from Pontus and oil from Attica. A ship sailing from Pontus to Piraeus passes by Kalidros. If Kalidros has a safe harbor, the captain can stop by to wait out bad weather or unload some of the cargo. They pay for docking and unloading. That money will cover the costs in 3 years. We just need to convince the merchants to invest now in a port that doesn't exist yet. Show them that the investment will pay off. Helena said it's like selling fish that's still in the sea. Dan said yes, exactly. Helena looked at him. Then she said that for this, we need an accountant whom the merchants will trust, not Dan. A nameless outsider won't inspire confidence in merchants. They need a local, with a reputation, who knows the numbers. Helena said she knew such a person, or rather, such a woman. Iris, the daughter of Menander, the chief merchant of Kalidros. Menander was the richest man in the city, which didn't mean much, because the whole of Kalidros could be bought for a sum an Athenian merchant wouldn't even notice. But Menander had been in business for 30 years, and his name was known from Miletus to Chios, and his daughter Iris had been keeping his books since she was 14. Because both of Menander's sons had died in an epidemic, she was the only one left, a young girl, quick, with sharp eyes. Dan met her the next day at Menander's house. The house was larger than Stephanos. 2 rooms, furniture, fabrics on the walls. Iris sat at a table piled high with clay tablets and was counting. 19 years old, she looked 16. But when she led her eyes to Dan, there was nothing childish in them. Menander stood nearby, a big man with a shrewd face. He looked at Dan with interest, but without trust. Helena asked him to let Iris work with Dan on the calculations for the port. Menander said his daughter didn't work for free. Dan said that nobody works for free. He named a salary. Menander raised his eyebrows. Iris raised her eyebrows. It was serious money for Kalidros. Menander asked where the funds would come from. Dan said from those same 2 talents, which hadn't been fully spent yet. Menander thought it over. Iris didn't think twice. She had already done the math. She asked Dan how many ships the port would need to handle per day. Dan said 3 to start with, then 5, up to 10 in 2 years. Iris asked what the average cargo size was. Dan said he didn't know the local measurements. Iris gave them. Dan did the math in his head. He estimated the tonnage. He gave the figures in local units. Iris wrote them down. She asked what the berthing fee was. Dan looked at her, then at Helena. He said that this was exactly what he needed from Iris, for her to calculate the rates, because he was an engineer, not a merchant. He knew what kind of port to build. But he doesn't know how much to charge for berthing so that ships will come and the money will come back. Iris looked at him with a long, appraising gaze. Then, for the first time during the entire conversation, she smiled. She said she needed a week. A week later, Iris came to Helena with the charts. Dan was there with her. Iris laid out the calculations, berthing fees, unloading fees, a separate fee for using a crane that didn't exist yet, a fee for warehouse storage, a tax on every transaction made within the port, plus a separate clause. Menander and 2 other merchants were willing to lend 10 talents of silver, on the condition that for the first 3 years, a portion of the port fees goes to them. Then the port is transferred entirely to the city. Helena read the signs, slowly, carefully. Then she looked up at Iris. She asked how a 19-year-old girl had convinced 3 adult merchants to lend 10 talents of silver. Iris shrugged. She said she'd shown them the harbor after the storm, standing, intact, a rock in the water. Merchants know how to count. If the pier stands, then there will be a port. If there's a port, then the money will come back. Helena smiled for the first time in front of Dan, barely noticeable, for half a second. Then she became serious again. She approved the plan. Dan got his money, his workers, and his 2 years. Construction began in earnest. Dan divided the work into 3 areas. First, the main pier, extending that 20-meter stub to a full 200 meters. That was the foundation. Without the main pier, there was no protection for the bay. Second, the northern breakwater. Shorter than the pier, but no less important. It was supposed to close off the bay from the north, where the wind blew in the winter. Third, the wharf. A real stone wharf along the eastern shore, with bollards, with ladders into the water, with a flat platform on top for unloading. A foreman was needed for each section. Dan put Nikon in charge of the pier. The old mason knew stone like no one else. Themia was put in charge of the breakwater. The young guy had grown up over these past months. He stopped laughing at Taya. He started listening. He started thinking. Dan put a new man on the pier, Alkim, a carpenter. He was one of the first to come to Dan after the storm. Quiet, skilled. He knew wood as well as Nikon knew stone. The pier required both stone and wood, so Alkim worked alongside one of the stonemasons. Taya became the chief quality control supervisor for all 3 sections. She walked from the pier to the breakwater and from the breakwater to the wharf. She checked the mortar. She checked the masonry. She rejected it if it was subpar. The workers no longer argue with her. After the storm, everyone saw that the pier she had supervised was still standing. Callie expanded her operations. Now she had not 10 workers, but 40, then 60. She set up a makeshift first aid station in a fisherman's hut by the shore. Clean rags for bandages, ointments for burns, herbal teas for fever. Dan asked her to keep records. Who was injured? When? How? What kind of injury? Callie asked why. Dan said that if they knew where people were most likely to get injured, they could change the process so there would be fewer injuries. Callie looked at him. Then she said he was a strange man. But she started keeping the records. A month later, she came to Dan with the results. Most of the injuries happened while lifting stones. Arms, backs, legs. People were hauling stones on their backs, lifting them with their hands. They were straining themselves. Dan nodded. He said it was time to build a crane, the first crane in Kalidros. Dan spent 3 days designing it. He sketched on a board with charcoal. He erased it. He sketched again. The principle was simple, a pulley system, a system of pulleys through which a rope passes. One person pulls the rope through 4 pulleys and lifts a load 4 times heavier than they could lift directly. Physics, simple physics. But no one in Kalidros had ever seen a pulley system. Dan demonstrated the principle to Nikon, tied a stone to the rope, threw it over a branch, pulled. The stone rose. Then he added a second pulley, threw the rope over, pulled. The same stone rose twice as easily. Nikon watched. He was silent. Then he said it was like magic, only without the magic. Dan said that was exactly right. Alkin built the crane frame in a week, sturdy, out of oak logs. Dan added pulleys and ropes. The first test was conducted in the morning in front of the entire construction site. A marble block, heavy. 4 men couldn't lift it to the height of the pier. Dan hooked the block with a hook. He threaded the rope through the pulley block. 2 men pulled. The block crept upward, slowly, smoothly, without jerks. It rose to the height of the pier wall. It paused. Dan showed how to swing the boom. The block drifted to the side and settled exactly into place. The construction site fell silent. 60 people stood and watched. Then someone laughed. Not out of mockery, out of surprise. Then everyone started chattering at once. Then they ran to feel the ropes and blocks and try to figure out how it worked. Nikon stood next to Dan. Tico said that now he really believed. Not in the mole, in the fact that Dan was from some other place. Because no one in this world would have thought of something like that in a single lifetime. Dan didn't answer. The crane changed the construction site. Work sped up twofold. Stones that used to be hauled by 10 people were now lifted by 2. Backs stopped straining. Callie noted in her records that back injuries had dropped by 2/3. Dan was building a port, stone by stone, meter by meter. And with each passing day, Kalidros changed. After the storm, Helena gave Dan full carte blanche to build a real port. Iris developed a tariff system and secured 10 talents of silver from local merchants. Construction was divided into 3 sections, led by foreman Nikon, Femi, and Alkim. Dan built the first pulley crane, which doubled the pace of work and reduced injuries. Taya became the quality control supervisor for all sections. The port grew, and with it, so did the problems. By the 5th month, 70 people were working on the construction site. The main pier reached 60 meters, the northern breakwater 30. The quay wall stretched 40 meters along the eastern shore. Dan woke before dawn and went to bed after sunset. Between those points were concrete and stone and ropes and the shouts of workers and the smell of lime and sweat. He had lost weight. His hands had grown rough and dark from the sun. His beard had grown out. Stefanos said Dan had started to look like a local. Only his eyes gave him away. Too quick. They think too much. The first real trouble came quietly. Dan noticed it himself. In the morning, he was checking the masonry on the breakwater and saw that the concrete in 2 blocks of the top row was crumbling. Not on the outside, from the inside. He pried out a piece with a knife. He looked at it. He sniffed it. He licked it. Bitterness. The wrong kind of bitterness. The lime was different. Not the kind Gemin usually mixed. Someone had swapped out the lime. Dan didn't make a fuss. He went to Gemin, asked where yesterday's batch of lime had come from. Gemin said it had been brought from the kiln as usual. Dan went to the kiln. The kiln stood behind the northern hill. 2 men were working there. They said a man had come by yesterday, not from the construction site, from the city. He brought a bag of lime and said it was an additive from Nikon. They mixed it in. Didn't think twice. Nikon hadn't sent anything. Dan took a sample of the mixed lime. He showed it to Callie. She sniffed it, rubbed it between her fingers. Said it wasn't pure lime. There was something in it. It looked like sea salt, but wasn't quite. Some kind of additive that destroys the mortar from the inside. Poisoned lime. Dan sat on a rock by the kiln and thought, who wanted the concrete to crumble? Not now, in a month or 2, when it would have grown another 50 meters. Then it would have collapsed. And not just the 20-meter test section, 100 meters, right before the whole city's eyes. And with it, faith in Dan would have collapsed. In the port, in everything. He dismantled 2 defective blocks that same day. The workers asked why. He said he'd found an air bubble in the mortar. He didn't mention sabotage. He didn't want to cause a panic. But he posted guards at the lime kiln, 2 workers on rotating shifts, and he ordered Gamon to personally inspect every batch of lime, to mix a test sample, wait 24 hours. If the sample crumbles, throw the batch away. Gamon nodded. He didn't ask why. He was a smart, quiet man and understood without words. Dan went to Helena. He told her in private. Helena listened in silence. Her face didn't flicker. Then she asked who he suspected. Dan said he didn't know. Maybe someone from the city who's bothered by the port. Maybe someone from outside. Helena said the old fishing families had a motive. The new port would kill their monopoly on the wharves. Right now, every ship entering Kalidros pays for the wharves. The money goes to the 3 families who control the wharves. The new port will be city-owned. The fees will go to the treasury. The 3 families will lose their income. Dan asked if they could be included in the port's operations, give them a role, a share. Helena shook her head. She said she'd tried. They don't want a share. They want everything to stay the way it was. Dan understood. an internal enemy, quiet and stubborn. More dangerous than an external one because he lives 2 houses down from you. He tightened his control. Taya checked every section twice a day. Callie monitored the water the workers drank because it's not just lime that can be poisoned. Nikon put his youngest nephew on night watch over the materials warehouse. There were no more sabotage attempts. For now. Construction continued, the 6th month. The pier had reached 80 meters, the breakwater 50, the quay wall 60. The crane worked non-stop. Alchem reinforced its frame with additional struts after the boom began to creak under the heavy blocks. Dan was designing a second crane, bigger, with a longer boom, for the main pier where the blocks were heavier. Iris, meanwhile, was working. She sat in her room, poring over the tablets and calculating how much each meter of the pier cost, how much lime was used per day, how many donkey trips were needed for the ash, how much it cost to feed the workers. She came to Dan once a week and reported. For the first time in his life, Dan saw a financial report on clay tablets. But the numbers were accurate. Iris made no mistakes. One day, she came with news. She said that a ship from Chios passing by Kalidros had entered the bay. The captain saw the pier, the crane, and the dock and asked if he could dock to unload. The first ship. The first real merchant ship to enter Kalidros, not out of desperation, but by choice. Iris charged him for berthing and unloading at rates she had calculated herself. The captain paid without argument. He said they charge more in Theos and the wait is 3 days. Here, he docked in an hour. Iris brought the silver to Helena. She placed it on the table. Helena looked at the coins, then at Iris. She asked how much. Iris named the amount. It wasn't much, but it was the first. The port's first money. Helena took 1 coin and put it in her pocket. She said she'd keep it. Iris asked why she'd mess with the books. Helena laughed for the first time in her presence. By the end of the 6th month, Dan began thinking about the lighthouse. Not because the time had come, because a symbol was needed. The pier and the wharf were functional. They worked. But they're only visible from the bay. A ship coming from the sea doesn't know there's a port in Kalidros. A signal is needed, visible from 20 miles away. Dan went out to the southern cape of the bay, a rocky outcrop 15 meters high above the water, an excellent vantage point, visible from the sea to the south, east, and west. If a tower with a light at the top were placed here, any ship passing along the coast would see it. He stood on the cape and looked out at the sea. The wind blew in his face, salty, strong. Somewhere far away, a ship was sailing, a dark dot on the horizon, passing by, heading for Theos, or further, past Kalidros, which doesn't exist for this ship. Not yet. Dan pulled a piece of chalk from his belt. He bent down. He drew a circle on the rock, 3 meters in diameter, the base of a lighthouse. He placed a dot in the center. He stood up straight. He looked out at the sea. He said quietly to himself, "I'll bring you all here." He returned to town in the evening. Stephanos was waiting with dinner. Stephanos' wife had gotten used to Dan. She silently set a bowl in front of him, poured him some water. Dan ate and thought. Stephanos asked why he looked so gloomy. Dan said he was thinking about the lighthouse. Stephanos asked why. Dan explained. Stephanos listened. Then he said his grandfather had told him that there used to be a light on the southern cape, a long time ago, even before Kalidros became poor. Then firewood became expensive and the fire went out. Dan looked up. He asked how long ago. Stephanos shrugged. Maybe 50 years, maybe 100. His grandfather hadn't specified. Dan nodded. So the idea of a lighthouse wasn't new to this place. People had tried it before. They just gave up. He wouldn't give up. Over the next few days, Dan divided his time between construction and designing the lighthouse. During the day on the pier, in the evening with a board and chalk. The lighthouse couldn't just be a bonfire on a rock. A bonfire goes out in the rain. The wind blows out the flames. A tower was needed, a stone one, with a chamber at the top where the fire is protected from the wind but visible from all sides. He drew, he erased, he drew again. A tower 10 meters high, a square base, an octagonal shaft, At the top, a platform with stone walls and openings on all four sides. In the center of the platform, a bronze brazier. Behind the brazier, polished copper sheets, reflectors. The fire shoots forward, and the copper reflects it back, doubling the brightness. Simple optics, a primitive searchlight. But for this world, it was like turning on a light bulb in a cave. He showed the blueprint to Nikon. The old stonemason looked at it for a long time. Then he poked his finger at the octagon and asked why it had to be so complicated. Why not round? Why not square? Dan explained, a circle is harder to build without special molds. A square catches the wind with its flat walls. An octagon is a compromise. It cuts through the wind. Easier to lay than a circle. Stronger than a square. Nikon thought about it. He nodded. He said that Dan thought like water, flowing around corners. Dan didn't know if it was a compliment or an observation. He took it as both. By the end of the 6th month, construction of the port was in full swing. The pier, the breakwater, the wharf. Ahead lay the lighthouse. Ahead lay the warehouses. Ahead lay customs. Ahead lay the entire port. And ahead lay winter. Dan's second winter in this world. He had spent his first at Stefanos' house, under a goat hair blanket. He planned to spend the second one at the construction site. Because winter in the Ionian is mild. Rain, but no frost. You can build. Slower, but you can. And every winter day, when competitors are sitting at home, is a day of advantage. Theos didn't build in the winter. Kalidros will. Dan discovered the sabotage with poisoned lime and tightened security at the low. The first merchant ship entered Kalidros voluntarily and paid the port fee. Dan began designing a lighthouse on the southern cape with copper reflectors. Helena revealed that the sabotage was orchestrated by old fishing families losing their monopoly on the piers. Construction reached 80 meters of the pier and 50 meters of the breakwater. Winter arrived with rain, not cold rains, warm and heavy. Water poured from the sky 3 days out of 5. The ground became saturated. The trails to the ash quarry turned to mud. The donkeys got stuck. Ash deliveries dropped by half. Dan reassigned the work. Since there's not much ash, concrete is going only to the pier, the main pier, top priority. The breakwater and pier are currently being built dry stone, no mortar. Dry stone masonry, stone upon stone, small stones hammered between them for density. Nikon knew this technique better than anyone. His hands built dry masonry that lasted for decades. Not centuries like concrete, but enough for temporary sections that would later be reinforced with mortar. The workers didn't like winter. Wet, slippery, cold by morning. 3 had left. 2 had fallen ill. Callie treated them with herbal infusions and scolded them for walking barefoot on wet stone. Dan ordered wooden soles to be made, simple ones, a plank with rope fastenings, not shoes, a support. The workers laughed. Then they tried them. Then they stopped laughing. Their feet were warm. Their toes didn't freeze. Work went faster when they didn't think about the cold beneath their feet. Callie noted that colds had decreased after the soles were introduced. Dan began to suspect that Callie was keeping the first medical statistics in the history of this world. In the middle of winter, what Dan had been waiting for and fearing happened. An accident. A worker named Cleon, a young guy, 20 years old. He was laying stones on the top row of the breakwater. A wet stone slipped from his hands. Cleon lost his balance. He fell 4 meters onto the stone foundation. He broke his leg. An open fracture. The bone was sticking out of his shin. The scream could be heard all over the construction site. Callie was there in 2 minutes. She stopped the bleeding. She made a splint out of planks. She gave him something to drink for the pain. Cleon was moaning and turning pale. They carried him into town. Callie walked beside them, holding the splint. Dan stood on the breakwater and looked at the blood on the stones. He was shaking. Not from the cold, from the fact that this was his construction site, his decision, his responsibility. In Rotterdam, after something like this, an ambulance would arrive, followed by an inspection, a commission, reports, and insurance. Here, there was nothing. Just him, a broken leg, and a guy who might be crippled for life. That evening, Dan went to see Cleon. He was lying in his mother's house. His leg was in a splint. His face was ashen with pain. His mother sat nearby, silent. Dan sat down on the floor. He said it was his fault. He said he should have put up a guardrail on the top row, a railing, a rope, anything to keep a person from falling. Cleon's mother looked at him. She said, "The gods decide who falls." Dan shook his head. He said, "The gods might decide, but a railing keeps you from falling even when the gods have decided." His mother didn't understand. Cleon understood. He smiled faintly. He said that Dan was a strange but kind stranger. Dan left the house and went to the construction site. Night, rain, a torch in his hand. He walked through every section. He marked with chalk every spot where a person could fall. He counted 14 places where a worker could slip and break his bones, or his neck. The next day he stopped work for half the day. The workers stood and watched as Dan and Alchem set up rope railings along the upper rows of masonry. Simple wooden posts, a rope between them, at waist height. The workers said it was nonsense. The senior mason from Nikon's crew said calmly, "If the gods want him to fall, he'll fall even with your rope." Dan looked at him. He said calmly, "The rope doesn't argue with the gods. The rope just reminds the body that the edge is close. The body steps back on its own." The mason shrugged, but the railing stayed up. Over the next 3 months, not a single person fell from the height. Callie recorded this in her ledgers. Cleon was recovering slowly. His leg had healed, but it was crooked. He could no longer stand on the construction site all day. Dan found him another job. He put him in charge of inventory, counting bags of ash, counting stones, counting ropes. Cleon counted slowly but honestly. Iris checked his work and said the guy was smart, just untrained. She began teaching him numbers. Winter dragged on. The pier reached 110 meters, the breakwater 70, the wharf 80. 3 ships called at Kalidros over the winter. Not many, but each one paid. Each one left satisfied. Word spread along the coast. There's this little port, Kalidros. The pier is ready. The crane is working. They charge cheaply. No lines. They heard about it in Theos, too. A man came to see Dan, a merchant, not a local. Expensive clothes, soft hands, a professional smile. He introduced himself as Phylon from Theos. He said he'd come with an offer from important people. He sat down across from Dan by the fire on the shore. He spoke calmly. He said that in Theos they were impressed by Dan's work. He said that a master like Dan belonged in a real city. He said that the Archon of Theos, Leander, was ready to offer Dan citizenship, a house, a workshop, as many workers as he needed. Silver, lots of silver, a sack of silver. Phylon placed the sack on a rock between them. Dan looked at the sack, then at Phylon. He asked what he had to do in return. Phylon said nothing special, just move to Theos, build there, not build here. Dan was silent. Philo added, "He said that Leander wasn't a bad man. He doesn't want hostility. He wants order on the coast. 1 big port is better than 2 small ones. It makes sense. Dan should understand. He's an engineer. He understands efficiency." Dan really did understand. Philo was right from the perspective of economies of scale. 1 big port is cheaper than 2 small ones. Less duplication, more capacity, higher profits. All true. Except for one thing. Kalidros would cease to exist as a free city. It would become a suburb of Theos, a fishing village under its neighbor's control. Stephanos would pay Theos for the right to fish in his own bay. Nikon would lay stones on someone else's orders. Helena would lose everything. Dan looked at the bag of silver, then at the bay, at the pier he had built, at the crane that was working, at the dock where Thea was inspecting the masonry. He picked up the bag, handed it back to Philo, said he thanked Leander for the offer, but he would stay in Kalidros. Philo wasn't surprised. He stood up, said it was a pity, said there wouldn't be a second offer. He left. Dan watched him go. Then he looked at the pier. He said quietly, "Well, there you go. Now there'll be a war." He wasn't wrong. 2 weeks after Phylan's visit, the lumberyard caught fire at night. Wood for construction, logs for formwork, boards for the crane, all in one place, all dry. It burned fast and hot. By the time people had gathered with buckets, half the warehouse had turned to embers. Dan stood in front of the ruins. Black cinders, smoke, the smell of burnt wood. 2 months of Alkim's work, logs that had been hauled down from the mountains for a week, all of it. Alkim stood nearby. He was silent. Then he said he'd found a rag soaked in oil by the back wall of the warehouse. He set it on fire. Dan nodded. He said things would be worse now. Theos had gone from silver to fire. In the winter, the worker Cleon broke his leg, and Dan introduced rope safety railings on all sections. The merchant Philo from Theos offered Dan silver and citizenship to switch sides to Leander. Dan refused. 2 weeks later, arson destroyed the lumberyard. Theos moved from attempts at bribery to outright sabotage. The pier reached 110 meters and the breakwater 70. After the fire, Dan stopped sleeping normally. He woke up at every sound. He went out at night to check on the construction site. He walked along the pier with a torch, looking for clues. Stefano said he shouldn't do that a man without sleep breaks down faster than a tree without support. Dan knew Stefanos was right, but he couldn't stop. Helena convened a council. For the first time, she called Dan. For the first time, she called Iris. The counselors were displeased. Timon was in fury. But Helena didn't ask for their opinion. She said that Theos had started a war. Not a military one, not yet. A trade war and sabotage. The warehouse arson. Before that, the poisoned lime. What next? We need a plan. One of the advisors said we should send an embassy to Theos, to negotiate, to yield. Dan remained silent. A second advisor said we should hire security, guards for the construction site. Timon said we need to raise a militia and strike first. Helena raised her hand. Everyone fell silent. She looked at Dan. She asked what he thought. Dan stood up. He said we couldn't strike first. Kalidros is too small. Any war on foreign soil would destroy them. Negotiating is useless. Leander doesn't want peace. He wants a monopoly. Any agreement would mean shutting down the port, and shutting down the port means the death of Kalidros in 2 years. There is only one way. Build faster. Make the port so valuable, so essential to so many people that destroying it would cost more than putting up with it. Security? Yes, absolutely. But the main weapon is speed. Timon asked contemptuously what good stones would do when ships full of warriors arrived. Dan looked at him. He said that stones could stop ships, if the stones were placed correctly. Timon didn't understand. Dan didn't bother to explain. It was too early. Helena nodded. She ordered 10 men for guard duty, day and night, 4 shifts. She ordered Iris to find the money. Iris said there was money. Port fees from the winter had covered part of the expenses. If they sped up construction and accepted more ships, the money would come in faster. A vicious cycle. To make money, you have to build. To build, you have to make money. Iris knew how to break such cycles. She suggested selling birthing rights in advance. A captain pays now for 10 births over the course of a year. He gets a discount. Kalidros gets the money now. Dan looked at her and thought that in his world, this girl would have become a corporate CFO by the age of 30. Here she sat behind clay tablets in a small house, inventing subscription contracts 2,000 years before the word contract was even invented. Spring came early. With it came warmth and sunshine and the full-scale piles of ash. Construction surged forward. 100 workers, 2 cranes. The pier had reached 140 meters. The breakwater, 90. The wharf was finished for 100 meters. Along the wharf, Dan began building warehouses. Long stone buildings with wooden roofs. Simple, sturdy, with wide doors so that carts could drive inside. Iris designated each warehouse for a specific type of goods. Grain separately, oil separately, fabrics separately. Dan asked why not together. Iris looked at him as if he were a child. She said that grain next to oil is a fire hazard. Oil next to fabric is ruin. Every commodity lives in its own home. Dan smiled. He said that in his world, it's called zoning. Iris asked what kind of world that was. Dan remained silent. That spring, Dan began building a lighthouse. Nikon selected the best stone for him, white limestone from a quarry half a day's journey away. Strong, smooth, easy to work with. Taya personally inspected every block. She rejected the cracked ones. She rejected the porous ones. Out of 10 blocks, 7 passed inspection. The workers grumbled. Taya didn't react. The lighthouse's foundation was poured in 4 days. A circle on the rock of the southern cape, 3 meters in diameter, concrete, half a meter thick. The rock beneath it is solid. It wasn't going anywhere. Then they began laying the walls, an octagon. Each row of masonry was slightly narrower than the previous one. The tower tapered toward the top, slowly, 1 centimeter per row. Nikon grumbled that it was extra work. Dan explained, "The taper makes the tower more wind-resistant. The center of gravity is lower. The lateral load is less." Nikon grumbled, but did it. Melissa came to the lighthouse, a young priestess, Autolycos' niece. She stood at the foot of the rising tower and looked up. Dan noticed her. He walked over. She asked why the tower was octagonal. Dan explained the same thing he'd told Nikon. Wind. Strength. Melissa nodded. Then she said that 8 was Poseidon's number. His horses have 8 legs. 8 winds blow from the sea. Dan didn't know that. He looked at the tower. To him, the octagon was an engineering solution. To Melissa, it was a sacred number. Same thing. 2 languages. He said that was good, that the lighthouse should appeal to both engineers and gods. Melissa looked at him. Something flashed in her eyes. Not hostility, recognition, as if she had seen a man who didn't mock her world, but accepted it. She said she wanted to help. She asked how she could be of use. Dan thought for a few seconds. Then he said the lighthouse needed a lighting ceremony. The first fire must be sacred. People must believe that the lighthouse is protected by the gods. Otherwise, every storm, every flash of lightning, every strong wind will be a cause for fear. And if the fire is sacred, it means the gods are watching over it. Melissa nodded, slowly, seriously. She said she would devise a ritual with her uncle. Avtolik would be glad. She left. Dan watched her go. 17 years old, serious as an old woman, believes sincerely, not playing a role. It lives within her. He needed her faith, not as a tool, as a bridge, between his knowledge and the world of these people. The lighthouse grew, meter by meter. By mid-spring, the tower had risen 4 meters, 6 more to go. At the top, Dan was planning a platform with a brazier and copper reflectors. Iris found the copper. She struck a deal with a Phoenician merchant who brought copper ingots from Cyprus. She haggled for a price that made the merchant respect this little girl with sharp eyes. Dan got the copper. He gave it to the blacksmith Kalidros, an old man named Hephaestus. No, not Hephaestus. It was just that everyone called him that because he resembled the god of blacksmiths. Short, broad-shouldered, with scorched hands. Dan drew him a sketch of a reflector, a concave sheet of copper, polished to a mirror finish, 4 pieces, for the 4 cardinal directions. The blacksmith looked at the sketch, then at Dan. He asked why they needed to be polished. Dan took a small piece of copper, polished it with sand for 10 minutes. He placed it next to the fire. He turned it. A beam of light from the fire reflected off the copper and struck the wall, a bright spot on the stone. The blacksmith whistled. He said he'd do it. Helena convened a war council, and Dan convinced everyone that Kalidros' main weapon was the speed of the port's construction. Iris invented a system of prepaid berths to attract money. Construction of the lighthouse and warehouses began. Melissa offered to help with the lighthouse lighting ceremony. Dan ordered copper reflectors to amplify the lighthouse's light. By the end of the first year, the port of Kalidros existed. Not on blueprints, not in plans, in stone. The main pier stretched 170 meters, the breakwater 120. A 150-meter quay wall with 4 stone staircases leading into the water and 12 bollards for mooring. 2 cranes, 3 warehouses, a way station, a fishing pier separate from the commercial one. The lighthouse had grown to 7 meters and continued to grow. Dan stood at the end of the main pier on the first morning of the new year and looked out at the bay. Behind him was the sea. Before him lay calm waters enclosed by the pier and the breakwater on both sides. 4 ships were moored at the pier. 2 merchant ships, 1 larger fishing boat from Chios, 1 mysterious vessel with a long, predatory hull and a black sail. This one had arrived yesterday. Dan had been watching it. The ship had anchored not at the pier, but in the bay. The crew hadn't come ashore. It just sat there and watched. Dan knew what that meant. Reconnaissance. Someone had sent the ship to check out the port of Kalydros, to measure the length of the pier, the width of the bay entrance, the depth of the channel, the number of cranes, the number of people. Theos. Leander wasn't sitting idly by. He was gathering information. Dan didn't interfere. Let them look. Let them count. They would see what he wanted them to see, and they wouldn't see what he didn't want them to, because Dan was already thinking about defending the bay, not with walls, not with spears, with engineering. The entrance to the bay between the end of the pier and the end of the breakwater was 40 meters wide. Once both structures were completed, the entrance would narrow to 25. 25 meters of water through which a ship could pass. Enough for a merchant vessel, too little for a fleet. 2 ships couldn't pass side by side, only one at a time. And in that narrow passage, Dan intended to set a trap. Not now, when the time came. And the time would come. He sensed it as surely as he sensed the wave period by its sound. The dark ship left on the 3rd day. During the first week of the new year, a large grain freighter from Pontus called at Kalydros. It was a ship of a different class, not like the small vessels that had come in before. A real workhorse, wide, heavy, with a hold full of grain. The captain's name was Ariston, a Greek from Sinope, bearded, loud, with a gold earring in his ear. He came to Kalydros because the wait to unload in Theos was 3 days. 3 days of sitting at anchor, paying the crew, feeding the men, and waiting. In Kalydros, he docked in an hour. The crane started unloading right away. Ariston stood on the pier and watched as the crane lifted the sacks of grain and placed them on the cart, silently. Then he turned to Dan, who was standing nearby. He asked who had built this crane. Dan said he did. Ariston asked who built this port. Dan said he did, with the help of the people of Kalydros. Ariston looked at him. Then he said he'd been traveling along this coast for 20 years, and that a year ago there were rotten piers and goats here. Dan said the goats were still there. Ariston laughed, loudly, so the whole port could hear. Then he grew serious. He said he'd tell every captain from Sinope to Piraeus about Kalydros. He said the coast needed a port like this. He said that Theos charges triple the price and treats people like pigs. But here there's a crane and warehouses and fast unloading and a decent price. Dan thanked him. Ariston left 2 days later, fully unloaded. He paid for the full stay and unloading. Iris recorded everything down to the last coin. Then she came to Dan with the news. She said that if ships like this came in at least once a month, the debt to the merchants would be paid off in 2 years instead of 3. Dan nodded. He asked her to calculate how much it would cost to extend the pier by another 50 meters. Iris said she had already calculated it. She showed him the sheets. Dan read the numbers. Then he looked at Iris. He said she was thinking 2 steps ahead. Iris shrugged. She said 3. 2 isn't enough. Dan smiled. By the end of the first month of the new year, the lighthouse was finished. 10 meters of white stone on the cliff of the southern cape. An octagonal tower. A platform at the top with stone walls and openings. A bronze brazier in the center. 4 copper reflectors, polished to a mirror finish. Autolycos performed the lighting ceremony. Melissa stood nearby. She had written a prayer, a new one, especially for the lighthouse. Words about how Poseidon's light guides sailors through the darkness, and how the lighthouse stone stands upon the god's stone, and how the fire in his eyes illuminates the way home. Beautiful words, sincere. The whole town had come to the Cape. Stephanos, Nikon, Callie, Iris with her father, Thea, Alkim, Jamon, Cleon on crutches, workers, fishermen, women, children. Even Timon came. He stood off to the side, but he came. Autolycus climbed onto the platform. He said a prayer. He poured wine. He lit the fire in the brazier. The flame rose. It struck the copper reflectors, and light poured out in all directions. 4 beams, 4 directions. The sea lit up. The people below gasped, a single sound, a collective one, 100 gasps at once. They had seen lighthouses before, bonfires on the cliffs, dim, barely visible from a mile away. This one was different. The copper doubled the light. The reflectors gathered the flame and hurled it into the darkening sky. Stephanos said it would be visible from Chios. He was exaggerating, but not by much. From 20 miles away on a clear night, that fire was visible. Dan stood on the deck next to Autolycus. He looked out at the sea. Ships were passing by somewhere out there, heading past, toward Teos, toward Ephesus, toward Miletus. Now they would see the light, and some would turn around. Melissa walked up to him. She stood quietly beside him. She looked at the fire. Then she said that her uncle had called the lighthouse the Eye of Poseidon. Dan nodded. A good name. Melissa said it wasn't just a name. If the lighthouse is the eye of a god, then to extinguish it is sacrilege. No one would dare, not even Theos. Dan looked at her. A 17-year-old priestess had just given the lighthouse the best protection anyone could imagine. Not a wall, not a guard. Fear of the gods. He thanked her. She didn't understand why. A week after the lighthouse was lit, Dan was diving in the cove. He was marking the seabed for the next phase of construction. Expanding the pier required precise knowledge of the seabed's topography. He was diving with a rope and a weighted stone. Primitive. Cold. But it worked. On his 4th dive, his hand touched something smooth. Too smooth for the bottom of the cove. He surfaced, took a breath, dived again, felt around. A stone, hewn, with a right angle. He ran his hand further, another block, and another. Smooth masonry, under a layer of silt. At the bottom of Kalidros Bay lay the remains of a wall, or a pier, or a jetty. Too smooth a masonry for that era. He surfaced, sat down on the shore. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. Someone had already built here, a long time ago. Built well, built correctly, right angles, fitted blocks. Such precision is beyond this world. Not yet. Another 500 years. If only. If only the builder wasn't from this world. Dan sat on the shore and looked at the water. Beneath it lay the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. Who was here before him? By the end of the first year, the port of Kalidros was operational, with a pier 170 meters and full infrastructure. The first large grain ship from Pontus entered the port instead of Theos. The lighthouse was completed and lit with copper reflectors. Melissa named it the Eye of Poseidon, giving it religious protection. Dan discovered the remains of masonry at the bottom of the bay that was too precise for this era. Dan didn't tell anyone about the discovery at the bottom. Not yet. He returned the next day and dived again. And the next. And again. 3 days of diving. The water was murky. Silt rose with every movement. But his hands felt what his eyes couldn't see. Beneath the silt lay the remains of a structure. A wall 15 meters long, 3 courses high, rectangular blocks, fitted with a precision he'd seen in modern ports, not in ancient ones. Between the blocks were remnants of mortar. Dan chipped off a piece. He surfaced. He examined it in the light. Gray, dense, pozzolan concrete. His recipe. Exactly the same. He sat on the shore, holding the piece of concrete in his hands. Someone knew the same recipe. Someone from his world or a similar world had been here, had built here, and hadn't finished. A question that wouldn't let him rest. What had happened to him? He set the find aside. Didn't forget it, just set it aside. Because there was more work than he could handle. The second year began with a rush. The ships set sail. After Ariston's visit, word of Calidros spread along the coast. 2 ships a week, then 3, then 4. Small and medium-sized, coastal vessels and mid-sized traders, for whom Theos was too expensive and the small coves too dangerous. Calidros was just right. Safe, fast, cheap. A crane, warehouses, a way station, and a lighthouse visible from 20 miles out at sea. Iris was beaming. She wasn't smiling. Iris rarely smiled. She was beaming with numbers. The port's revenue for the first quarter of the second year exceeded the revenue for the entire first year. The debt to the merchants had decreased by 1/3. She went to Dan and said that at this rate the debt would be paid off in a year. Not in 2, as planned. In a year. Dan said, okay, because in a year they would need money. A lot of money. Iris asked what for. Dan said for a dry dock. Iris asked what a dry dock was. Dan explained. A place where a ship is pulled out of the water onto dry land for repairs. Not on a beach where it lies on its side in the mud. In a special basin, one that can be drained. And the ship stands level on supports. And the mechanics work on the hull as if it were a regular wall. From below, from above, from all sides. Iris thought about it. Then she said that no port on the coast has anything like that. Dan said that's exactly why. Calidros will be the only port where you can fix a ship properly. Captains will come here on purpose and pay. A lot. Because the alternative is to haul the ship ashore and pray the keel doesn't crack. Iris took notes. Then she asked how much it would cost. Dan gave a rough estimate. Iris didn't flinch. She was already used to his figures. She just nodded and went off to do the math. Dan began designing the dry dock. It was the most difficult task he'd faced since arriving in this world. More difficult than the pier. More difficult than the lighthouse. The principle is simple. Dig a basin near the shore. Line the walls with concrete. Build a gate. The ship enters. The gate closes. The water is pumped out. The ship sits on supports. Repairs. Then let the water back in. The gates open. The ship leaves. The principle is simple. The execution is monstrously difficult. The basin must be watertight. The gates must withstand the water pressure. The pumping system must work quickly. Dozens of details, each of which could derail the entire project. Dan drew plans for a week. He erased. He drew again. He showed it to Nikon. The old mason shook his head. He said it was madness. Then he looked at it some more. He asked questions. Then he started sketching his own versions. By the end of the week, they had found a solution for the gates together. 2 massive wooden shields, covered in leather, set into stone grooves. Water pressure presses them against the grooves. The higher the water outside, the tighter the gate. Simple physics working in the builder's favor. Nikon said it was beautiful. Not a word Dan expected from an old mason regarding the gate, but accurate. In the spring of the second year, Dan opened a school. Not a building, a place. A spot by the harbor where he taught young men every evening after work. Bricklayers, carpenters, apprentice laborers. 6 came at first, then 10, then 15. Dan taught them to draw, to count, how to use a spirit level, how to use a plumb line, how to mark right angles using a string and 3 pegs. He explained the Pythagorean theorem in a single evening. A triangle with sides 3, 4, and 5. The angle between the 3 and the 4 is always a right angle. Always. Everywhere. Without exception. A young bricklayer named Linos checked it the next day. He measured 10 angles at the construction site. All 10 were confirmed. Linos came in that evening with eyes ablaze and said that the world works by rules. Dan said, yes, that's exactly right. The world is built by rules, and the rules can be learned and used. Linos became his best student, quick, hungry for knowledge. A month later, he was marking angles more accurately than half the experienced masons. 2 months later, he was teaching the newbies himself. Timon watched from a distance. He didn't come over, but he watched. Dan noticed his figure at the edge of the yard, standing, watching, walking away. One evening, Dan found a piece of wood near the yard. A triangle had been drawn on it with charcoal, with sides 3, 4, 5. Crooked, uneven, but correct. Dan didn't know who had drawn it. He had his suspicions. Around the same time, an encounter took place that changed everything. A ship from Phoenicia had come into port for repairs. A medium-sized merchant vessel, battered by a storm. They needed to patch the hull and caulk the bottom. The crew poured out onto the pier. Among them was a figure who didn't fit in. Short, thin, in a hooded cloak, moving differently than the rest. Quieter, more cautiously. Dan stood on the pier, taking the ship in. The figure in the raincoat was the last to come down the gangway. She stopped, looked at the crane, for a long time. Then turned her head toward the lighthouse, visible from the pier. Then she lowered her gaze to the pier wall, to the concrete, to the masonry. The hood fell. A face. A young woman. Asian features. Short hair. Dark eyes. There was something in those eyes that Dan recognized instantly. Not the color. Not the shape. The expression. The expression of someone who sees the impossible and understands what it means. She was looking at the crane, at the pulley block, at the blocks and ropes, and her face was speaking, "I know what this is. I know where this comes from. You." She walked up to Dan, stopped 2 steps away. She was silent. Dan was silent. She raised her hand, pointed at the crane, then at the lighthouse, then at the concrete pier. Then she looked him in the eyes and said one word, quietly, almost a whisper, in Korean. Dan didn't know Korean, but from the way she said it, from the tremor in her voice, he understood. She was asking. "You too," he answered, in their shared language of this world. He answered yes. She closed her eyes, opened them. They were filled with tears. 5 years. She had been here for 5 years. Alone. The only person in the world who knew the earth was round. The only person who knew what an internal combustion engine was, and a cell phone, and coffee from the vending machine on the corner. 5 years of complete solitude among people of another era. And now she stands on the pier and looks at a crane that shouldn't exist in this century, at concrete that has no place here, and she understands. She is not alone. Her name was Son. In the evening, they sat on the pier, just the two of them, their feet dangling over the water. The sun was setting. Dan was drawing with charcoal on the stone, lines of latitude and longitude, a grid of coordinates. Son watched, silently. Then tears streamed down her cheeks, silently. She didn't wipe them away. She just sat there and looked at the lines she had last seen on the navigator's screen in the wheelhouse of a merchant ship in the port of Busan. In another life, in another world. Dan didn't touch her, didn't comfort her, just kept drawing. When he finished, she stared at the map for a long time. Then she said she needed a compass. She asked if he could make one. Dan thought, a compass, a magnetic needle. You need a magnetic stone. Magnetite, iron ore. It exists in this world. The Greeks know about it. They know it attracts iron, but they don't know it points north. He said he'd try. Son nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she told him how she ended up here. A storm in the Yellow Sea. A wave. Darkness. She woke up on the shore of Phoenicia, naked, just like him, 5 years ago. She hitched a ride on a Phoenician ship, pretended to be a mute barbarian from the Far East. She learned to handle the sails. She learned to read the stars. The captains kept her on board because with her, the ships never got lost. She knew navigation, not intuitive, scientific, courses, angles, stars, latitudes. She was a living compass. But she couldn't explain it. Who would believe a mute barbarian? Dan listened. Then he asked what she remembered about the moment of the transfer. Sohn said nothing. A storm, a crash, darkness, and then the shore. Nothing in between, just a feeling. The day before the storm, as if someone had called out. Dan froze. He'd had the same thing, the day before the accident, the feeling that someone was calling, quietly, from far away. They looked at each other, two people from different countries in the same world, cast into the same world at different times, to the same spot. Kalidros. It's no coincidence. Something brought them here. Something connected to this place. Maybe those stones on the seabed. Dan told Sohn about the underwater masonry. She wasn't surprised. She said she felt that Kalidros was special. From the sea, the bay drew her in, like a magnet, like the stone needed for a compass. They sat on the pier until dark. The lighthouse lit up behind them. The light struck the copper and scattered across the sea. Sohn turned around. She looked at the lighthouse, then at Dan. She said the lighthouse was beautiful. She said she'd seen it from the sea 20 miles away, and realized there was someone from home here, because no Greek in the 5th century would have thought of reflectors. Dan said he would think of it in a couple thousand years. Sohn smiled for the first time. A small smile, crooked, tired, but real. Dan asked her to stay. Sohn said she had nowhere to go. The Phoenician ship would leave in 3 days. She could have left with it. But why? There's a port here. There's a lighthouse. There's a man who knows what coordinates are. She said she'd stay. But she needed something to do. Not to sit around, not to wait. Something to do. Dan said he needed a navigator. Someone who could teach the local sailors to navigate by the stars. Not by feel, by the system. With charts, with tables. Sohn said she could do that. Dan nodded. Then he said that tomorrow they would dive down to those rocks on the seabed, together. Sohn said okay. The port's revenue skyrocketed, and Iris calculated that the debt would be paid off a year early. Dan began designing a dry dock and opened a school at the port. Sohn, a former captain trainee from Busan, arrived on a Phoenician ship and recognized the technology from her own world in the cranes and concrete. She stayed in Kalidros. Dan told her about the underwater masonry at the bottom of the bay, and they agreed to explore it together. They dived at dawn. The water was cold and dark. Dan led the way. Sohn followed, a rope between them, a weight stone on his belt. 3 breaths. The dive. Silt rose in a cloud, and Dan waited for it to settle. Then he moved along the wall. His hands slid over the blocks, even, smooth, fitted together with a precision Nikon could only dream of. Sohn touched his shoulder. She pointed down. He dove deeper. At the base of the wall lay a slab, large, flat, embedded in the silt. They surfaced, took a breath, dived again. Dan cleaned the slab with his hands. Sohn helped. The mud came off slowly. Lines appeared beneath it, not cracks, lines, carved into the stone. Letters. They surfaced a 3rd time. Dan said there was an inscription on the slab. Sohn nodded. She said she saw it. They dove a 4th time. Dan ran his fingers along the lines. The letters were unfamiliar, not Greek, not Phoenician, but among them were numbers, Arabic numerals, 0, 1, 9, 4, 7, 1947, 1947. They sat on the shore, wet and silent. Sohn spoke first. She said that 1947 was a year. Dan nodded. Someone from their world had been here in 1947, or had come here from 1947, had started building, didn't finish, left, or died, or was killed. Sohn asked what the letters were. Dan said he didn't know. Not Latin, not Cyrillic, maybe Japanese, maybe something else. Sohn asked him to describe them. Dan drew with charcoal on a stone what he remembered with his fingers, 3 symbols. Sohn looked at them for a long time. Then she said they weren't Japanese. They looked like Korean, old ones. She wasn't sure, maybe Hangul, maybe not. The silt had damaged some of the lines. They'd have to dive again and clean it more carefully. Dan said it could wait. There were more important things to do right now. The slab had been lying on the bottom for 1,000 years or a few decades. It didn't matter. It could wait a little longer. Sone agreed. But Dan could see that the discovery wouldn't let her rest. Someone had been here before them. A Russian, maybe. A builder, definitely. And he'd vanished. Dan returned to the construction site. The second year was in full swing. They'd started digging the dry dock at the beginning of summer. 20 men with shovels and baskets were digging a basin at the eastern edge of the bay. 10 meters long, 4 meters wide, 3 meters deep. The soil was hauled away in wheelbarrows. The walls were lined with concrete as they dug deeper. The work was hard and dirty. People stood knee-deep in mud and shoveled. Dan worked with them, every day, in the mud, with a shovel. Not because it was more efficient, because people needed to see that he wasn't standing on the sidelines while they were working themselves to the bone. Nikon told him one evening, said the workers were talking about him. They said the stranger digging alongside them wasn't the boss. He was a comrade. Dan said that's exactly what he was. Nikon shook his head. He said that's not how it works in Kalidros. The foreman gives orders. The workers do the work. The foreman doesn't get his hands dirty. Dan said that in his world, the best foremen always get their hands dirty. Nikon snorted, but there was respect in his eyes. Meanwhile, Sohn began her work. Every evening at the square by the port, she gathered sailors, fishermen, young navigators. She taught them the stars, not myths about constellations. They'd been taught that since childhood. She taught navigation, how to determine latitude by the height of the North Star, how to use an outstretched arm to measure angles, each finger 2 degrees, a fist 10, a palm was 15. The sailors listened. Some didn't believe her. One old fisherman said the sea couldn't be measured. Sone asked him how he knew where he was when the shore wasn't in sight. He said he could feel it, the wind, the waves, the smell. Sone nodded. She said that was right, but she added that the senses work when you're healthy, not tired and sober, and the stars always work. The fisherman thought about it. Then he came back the next evening. Dan looked at Sone and saw her come alive. 5 years of silence, 5 years of pretense. Now she speaks, teaches, does what she knows how to do. Her face changed day by day. The harsh lines softened. Her eyes lost their wariness. She still flinched at loud noises. She still slept lightly, but she was already laughing. Rarely, quietly, but she was laughing. By midsummer, ships began arriving in Kalidros not just for trade. 3 captains came specifically for repairs. The dry dock wasn't ready yet, but the pier allowed for minor repairs in the water. Alchem assembled a crew of carpenters. They caulked. They replaced the planking. They filled the cracks with resin. They worked quickly and efficiently. The captains paid and left satisfied. Iris introduced a separate rate for repair work. Dan looked at the port and saw a mechanism. Ships arrive. They unload. They load. They are repaired. They pay. They leave. Others arrive. The wheel turns. Money flows. The city grows. New houses. New workshops. New people. Kalidros grew by 500 people in a year. Newcomers, workers, craftsmen, families. People were drawn to the light of the lighthouse, to the sound of cranes, to the smell of fresh concrete and new money. Theos was losing ships, slowly, 1 or 2 a month. Captains chose Kalidros, faster, cheaper, a crane, warehouses, a lighthouse, no waiting in line. Leander, the Archon of Theos, counted the losses, and his patience was wearing thin. Dan knew the blow was coming. He didn't know when. He was preparing. Dan and Sohn found the Arabic numerals 1947 and possibly Korean letters on an underwater slab, confirming that someone from their world had been in Kalidros before. Construction of the dry dock began. Sohn opened a navigation school for sailors. The port became a self-sustaining operation, and Kalidros grew by 500 people. Theos began losing ships to Kalidros. The blow came in the fall of the second year. At first, small jabs. A Kalydros merchant returned from Ephesus with the news that he had been denied entry into the port. They said that under a new agreement with Theos, ships from Kalydros were no longer being served. Then a second one. A third. Leander was applying pressure. Not with military force, with commercial force. He was signing agreements with other ports. He was paying them not to accept Kalydros ships. A blockade, non-military, but effective. Iris brought the figures. The port's monthly revenue had fallen by a quarter. If the trend continued, in 6 months, Kalydros would be unable to pay its workers. Helena convened a council. This time, Timon didn't argue. He sat in silence. He listened. Something had changed in him over the past few months. The anger hadn't gone away, but understanding had joined it. He saw the port every day. He saw how the crane worked, how ships arrived, how people got jobs and money. He didn't like Dan, but he began to respect what Dan had built. Dan proposed a plan. Don't wait. Don't complain. Hit Theos with his own weapon. Kalydros must become a port that cannot be blocked. This requires direct contracts with major merchants. Not through middlemen. Directly. Ariston of Sinope. Phoenician carriers. Merchants from Cyprus. People whom Theos couldn't control because they were too far away and too rich to fear Leander. Helena asked who would go to negotiate. Dan said Sonet. Everyone looked at him. Sonet sat in the corner, quiet and inconspicuous. Dan explained. Sonet had sailed these seas for 5 years. She knows every captain from Phoenicia to Pontus. They know her. They respect her. A mute barbarian who never loses a ship. She is no longer mute. She speaks the language of sailors, the only language that matters, roots and money. Helena looked at Sonet. Sonet looked at Helena. 2 women, both in a world not made for them, both surviving by wits, not strength. Helena nodded. Sonet sailed away 3 days later on a passing ship. Iris left with her. It was Iris's idea. She said that Sonet knew the sailors and she knew the numbers. Together, they were more convincing. Dan didn't argue. They were gone for 2 months. For 2 months, Dan built. He finished the dry dock. The gate worked. They assembled a water pumping system out of 20 buckets on a rope loop that the gate turned. Primitive, slow, but it worked. The first ship entered the dry dock in mid-autumn. A fisherman from Chios, an old vessel with a rotten hull. Alkim inspected it. He said it couldn't be repaired in the water, only in the dry dock. The gates were closed. They pumped out the water for 2 days. The ship was placed on supports. Alkim and his men worked for 4 days. They replaced 6 planks of the hull planking. They caulked the entire hull. They filled the seams with hot resin. They opened the gates. They let the water in. The ship rose, intact, sturdy. The fisherman owner stood on the pier and looked at his vessel as if it were a newborn child. He paid twice what they asked. He said he'd never seen anything like it in his life. Word of the dry dock spread along the coast faster than word of the lighthouse. 2 ships came in for repairs a week later. 3 2 weeks later. Iris was right. The dry dock brought in money that the blockade couldn't cut off, because even the ships of Theos's allies needed repairs, and there was nowhere to repair them except Kalydros. Leander understood this, and then the mercenaries came, at night. 12 men, with swords. They disembarked from a boat on the southern shore of the bay. They were heading for the shipyards. The goal was clear, to set fire to the dry dock, destroy the cranes, break what cannot be bought and cannot be blocked. The guards spotted them too late. Too late. The mercenaries were already at the crane on the main pier when Alkim raised the alarm. Noise, shouts, torches. People ran out of their houses. Dan ran out of Stephanos' house. He ran toward the port. He saw the flames by the crane. He heard the clang of metal. The mercenaries were cutting the crane's ropes. One had already set fire to a pile of shavings at the base of the boom. The flames licked at the wood. Dan reached the scene. He grabbed a bucket of water standing by the warehouse. He doused the fire. The mercenary turned toward him, sword in hand. Dan wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a fighter. He was a 32-year-old engineer with calluses from lime and a bad back. The mercenary took a step toward him. Stephanos shoved Dan aside. The old fisherman stood between them, a grappling hook in his hands. Next to him stood Phemios with a hammer. Next to him, Alkim with a sledgehammer. 10 more men stood nearby. Dock workers, bricklayers, carpenters, stevedores, the men who had built this port with their own hands. The mercenaries were professionals. The workers weren't. But there were more of them, and they were defending what was theirs. The fight was short and dirty. 4 mercenaries were knocked down. The rest ran toward the boat. 2 workers were wounded, 1 seriously. Callie was there within minutes. She stopped the bleeding, bandaged the wounds, swore like a sailor. Dan stood by the crane. The boom was charred on one side. The ropes were cut. But the crane was still standing. The base was intact. The mechanism was intact. It could be repaired in a week. Alkim was already calculating what was needed. Timon emerged from the darkness with a sword, a real one. He stood over one of the mercenaries lying on the rocks, alive. Timon didn't strike him. He just stood there, looking at Dan. Then he spoke quietly. He said they would come again, with a larger force. Dan nodded, said he knew. Timon said that a boy had nothing to teach a man, and that he understood that, but that there was one thing he understood better than Dan: war. He asked permission to organize the port's defense. Dan looked at him. He saw a 16-year-old boy who, in a year, had become someone else, not a man yet, but no longer a child. He said that Timon didn't need his permission. It was his city. Timon nodded. He left. In the morning, 25 armed men stood at the port, the Kalydros militia. Timon was in command. Theos had begun a trade blockade of Kalydros. Sohn and Iris had sailed away to negotiate direct contracts with major merchants. The dry dock was completed and had begun generating revenue that the blockade could not cut off. Theos's mercenaries attacked the port at night, but were repelled by the workers. Timon switched sides to Dan and took charge of organizing the defense. The winter of the second year was spent in preparation. Dan was building. Timon was preparing the defenses. 2 parallel tasks, 2 sides of the same mission: to save Kalydros. Dan extended the main pier to 200 meters, the northern breakwater to 150. The entrance to the bay narrowed to 25 meters, just as he had planned. A narrow choke point through which only 1 ship could pass. Not 2, 1. On either side of the entrance, the walls of the pier and the breakwater rose up, stone, tall, sturdy. Dan had designed platforms on them, officially for observation posts, in reality, for something else. At the bottom of the bay's entrance, Dan had laid 2 rows of stone bollards, massive stone pillars sticking out of the water by half a meter at low tide and hidden at high tide. A chain stretched between the bollards, thick, iron. The blacksmith of Kalydros had forged it, link by link, for 2 months. The chain could be raised and lowered. The mechanism was simple. A gate on the pier, 2 men turn it. The chain rises between the bulls. It blocks the entrance. A ship cannot pass. Timon looked at the chain, then at the bulls, then at the narrow entrance, then at the platforms on either side. He smiled slowly. He said he understood now. Dan hadn't built a port. Dan had built a trap. Dan shook his head. He said he had built a port. But a good port can always become a fortress, because a good port controls the water, and whoever controls the water controls everything. Timon organized a militia, 50 men, fishermen, laborers, young men from Dan's school. Not warriors, but Timon trained them every day. Spears, shields, formation, the simplest commands: stand, move, strike, retreat. He wasn't a great commander. He was a boy who read about wars and dreamed of glory. But that dream gave him a tenacity that the experienced but weary men lacked. Sohn and Iris returned at the end of winter, with news, good and bad. Good. 4 major trading houses had signed contracts with Keldros. Direct, no middlemen. Ariston of Sinope, the Phoenician house of Baal from Sidon, a Cypriot copper merchant, and unexpectedly, the Athenian merchant Diocles, who did business with Piraeus and was looking for an alternate port in case of war. The bad news. Leander is building a fleet. Not a merchant fleet, a military one. 20 ships, maybe more. He'll arrive in the spring. Helena listened. Her face didn't flinch. She was used to bad news. She asked Dan if the port was ready. Dan said it was ready. She asked Timon if the people were ready. Timon said he would do everything he could. Helena nodded. Then she did something no one expected. She sent a message to Athens. Not to Diocles the merchant, to the council. An official message from the city-state of Keldros to the city-state of Athens, with a proposal for a trade alliance, with a description of the port, with Iris's figures, and with a subtle hint that Theos, who attacks a free trading city-state, threatens not only Kalydros, but also Athenian trade routes. Helena wasn't playing at the level of the bay. She was playing at the level of the sea. Dan looked at her and thought that this woman could run a Fortune 500 corporation. Spring had come, and with it came Leander. Not right away. First came the proposal, the final one. A messenger delivered the letter.